This is the introduction to the subject you'll be working on in English for the next couple of weeks. As you can see, this project is going to be all about Cinderella stories. What we hope to accomplish with this is that you learn about the differences between Cinderella stories from all different cultures of the world and learn to understand why the stories are different and yet why they are similar. The major deliverables that you will have for this project is a PowerPoint that you will make comparing different Cinderella stories and your own Cinderella story based upon your own background. The reason we're looking at Cinderella stories and fairy tales in general is because, well, these are stories that have been around for a long time. They exist in every culture of the world. And because of that, we believe that they can teach us something about ourselves. In looking at these stories, we're going to use what the IB calls areas of exploration. In fact, areas of exploration are just nothing more than different lenses, different ways of looking at texts. And we use these ways to look at texts both of a literary and a non-literary type. The three areas of exploration that the IB has labeled are readers, writers, and texts, time and space, and intertextuality. Readers, writers, and text is really quite simple. It's about close reading of the text and understanding the relationship between why the writer chose to do it in certain ways or why you react to it in certain ways. Time and space looks a bit further at the elements surrounding the text, such as when it was written, where it was written, and what kind of things affected the choices of the subject matter and the way it's approached. And lastly, intertextuality is just a big word for the relationship between texts. All texts borrow in some way from other texts that came before them, and intertextuality it looks at, well, what we borrow and why we borrow it and how we borrow it. Fairy tales are all about storytelling, and we have to ask ourselves, why do we tell stories? Stories are important to us. They explain to people what sometimes they don't understand. They used to bring people together. Stories communicate a lot of our past, of our traditions. And lastly, stories are just fun. In looking at the stories, it's important to understand, well, how do they come about? Each culture has their own different stories. Each culture has their own reasons for telling them. It's also important to understand who the stories are for and why we tell them the stories. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail. Take a look at these trees. These are all pictures of trees drawn by students in different countries. As you can see, depending upon where you live, you imagine a different kind of tree. If I just asked you to draw a tree, well, you're more likely than not to draw the tree that the German children drew, rather than the one the Chinese children drew. So, if our context influences the way we see the world, it also influences the way we talk about it. So what is context exactly? Context is everything that goes into shaping, well, the way we see things, both as writers and as readers. In context, and understanding context, it helps us understand the information that we're being given. So when we talk about context, we're talking about the what that's happening. We talk about the why it happened, and we talk about what it means. We need context because without it, we don't really understand why the writer made the choices he did. And a writer generally writes for a certain type of reader. So it's also important to understand, well, the context of the intended reader of a story. And lastly, we have to understand our own context because we may not interpret a text exactly the same way that the original writer did or his audience. And we have to understand our differences from them, then we understand why that happens. A very, very important part of context is culture. Now, we talk about sometimes different types of culture. We talk about culture with a big C, culture with a little c. Culture in general, there's other ways of looking at it. Culture, there's the material culture, the buildings around us, the statues, uh, our churches and synagogues, our government buildings, our schools. Then there's the non-material culture, the beliefs we have, our values, our institutions, even our language. This popular culture, this high culture, and this little subcultures. Culture is very, very much part of our context. This, for example, are examples of all the things that go into our material culture. You can see buildings, artifacts, statues. Immaterial culture, things like our concepts of beauty, the foods we eat, the way we pray, the things we think are important, our sports. And of course, high culture and popular culture, you know, opera versus rap music, haute cuisine versus fast food, etc. Lastly, in looking at these stories, particularly the stories that you're going to develop at the end of this project, it's important to look at identity and who we are and what are the things that have shaped us. And there's a lot more in there than context. There's our own personal experiences that are very specific only to us. And so that too will come into play when we look at the stories that we're going to be talking about. So when looking at fairy tales, we have to look at it in a wider context. Where do they come from? How do they start? We can distinguish between three basic types of stories: myths, legends, and folk tales. Myths are some of the oldest stories that we have. They date back a long time, and they generally exist to explain something very, very major, something important. The creation of the world, the great flood, life and death. Myths generally tend to have supernatural beings. They generally tend to revolve around gods. As such, they're very, very close to religion. Many of the myths that we look at and talk today were once the religions of other people. Then there are legends. Legends are, folk tales that generally tend to have something to do somehow with some historical event that we think is important. It's hard to distinguish exactly when something is a myth and when something is a legend. And a simple way of thinking about it is that myths involve gods and legends involve people. Lastly, there are folk tales. And folk tales were often just little stories told to amuse, told to explain more trivial events. They could involve people, they could involve mythical beings, they could often involve animals. They go from generation to generation, and they date from a time before we had a written language. We can distinguish between four different types of folk tales: what they call trickster tales, tales in which the main character, the protagonist, is the one who causes trouble for others, a little prankster, a troublemaker. There are fables. These are short stories, often with morals. Many of these fables have animals. The most famous example is Aesop's fables from ancient Greece. Pourquoi stories. Pourquoi is the French word for why, and they're little stories to explain little things. If you remember, things fall apart. Explain why the tortoise has a shell made of pieces. Explain why mosquitoes buzz. Things. Yeah. And lastly, fairy tales. Stories often told to amuse children. Fairy tales often involve fairies and other mythical beings, and sometimes, or very often, magic. One of the basic elements of folk tales is they generally tend to be moralistic. They tend to be about good versus evil. They're simple stories with flat characters. Generally, folk tales almost always are stories that begin with something like once upon a time, indicating that they happened a long, long time ago, but we don't know exactly when. They have very, very straightforward plots, lots of action, and they involve conflicts that are often resolved through great deeds or acts of kindness. You know, it's important. The moral of the story is important, and so we see that in what goes on in there. Since they're meant for children, often the language is simple, straightforward, and there's a lot of repetition to it. And like other myths and legends, often has a magic involved, animals, etc. Maybe some magical being as a helper. So, first question we have for you is, what comes to mind when you think of Cinderella? Now, at this point, I'm going to ask you to stop the video and watch video number 2 on the list. When you're ready, press the go button to continue this presentation. In particular, we're going to be looking at Cinderella stories. Cinderella stories have been around for a long, long time. The oldest version we have of Cinderella dates back to the 7th century BC, about a slave girl named Rhodopis, a Greek slave girl who marries an Egyptian king. The Cinderella story we know today, the most common version, the Disney version, comes from the version published in 1697 by Charles Perrault. It's a classical story, and most of you know it, but if you don't, you'll find out about it in a minute. Another very famous version, one perhaps a more accurate, older version of the story, is the one that was published by the Brothers Grimm in 1812. Stop this presentation now and watch video number 3 on the list. At this point, we're going to stop the lesson for today, and we will continue this presentation next week.